Thank you, Eddie Sutton, for welcoming us to this incredible room at the Strand and for keeping the Strand such a vital part of our lives. Thank you, Ian Frazier, for joining me here. I have been a groupie of Ian's for 25 years since I first read Great Plains, which remains one of my most beloved books ever. If you haven't read Great Plains, you should pick it up on your way out. I wanted to do a couple things before we start the conversation. One is just to explain a little bit about why I chose the geography I chose for the book, and the other is to do a little reading. So let me start with the geography. The book unfolds as a trip down the Mississippi River, and the Mississippi River, it's the third largest river in the world. It's the only outsized by the Amazon and the Congo. But we who live in flyover country, I think, overlook its significance. It's really at the center of the American story in almost every imaginable way. It carries 1 million tons of silt and clay in it every day, or it did before we re-engineered it. But that mud, it's called the Big Muddy for that reason, and that mud actually built the American continent. It built all of the land from Missouri down to Louisiana. When it overtopped its banks, it built the rich heartland soils that our food supply depends on. It built its own delta and those wetlands that are just about half of the marshland in the United States and an absolutely critical ecosystem. It's been absolutely critical to American history. The geography of the watershed maps almost perfectly with the Louisiana Purchase, which Thomas Jefferson foresaw would determine the destinies of the Republic. Mark Twain called it the body of the nation. Ian Frazier said in his book Hogs Wild, in one of the essays in Hogs Wild, which is also a wonderful collection, he says, the Mississippi is us and vice versa. This is where Lewis and Clark took their famous journeys and Huck Finn and Jim theirs. It's where many of the most significant battles of the Civil War were fought and lost. It's where most of our natural wealth still resides. Up in the mountains, our oil supplies, our coal supplies, our copper and other mineral supplies. From those Great Plains come our meat and our grains and our legumes, our beans. And from its estuaries and the Gulf of Mexico beyond its delta come most of our seafood. So it remains totally central still to our food supply. And lastly, it's really critical to our politics. In addition to mapping on the Louisiana Purchase, it also maps almost perfectly onto red state America. So figuring out who we are as a country often happens in that territory. If you read the title essay in Ian Frazier's book, you will discover that it also maps almost perfectly on the population of feral hogs in America. His essay is entirely about feral hogs. I actually have 2 hog cameos in my 3rd chapter. In both cases, they are either trying or succeeding at eating people. So the book unfolds in 5 long chapters. Basically, I begin in the headwaters of the Missouri, which is the furthest northernmost reach of the Mississippi, with a cowboy named Dusty Crary. He's a former rodeo champion who has been really instrumental in saving hundreds of thousands of acres of both private ranches and public wildlands. And he raises his cattle alongside grizzlies and wolves. I then write about a Kansas farmer, a large-scale farmer from Kansas. I go out onto the Mississippi River with the CEO of a barge company that navigates all of the inland waterways that provide this tremendous connectivity to both within the country and with the continent and the rest of the world. I go into the Louisiana Wetlands with Sandy Wen, who is a Vietnamese refugee who is the advocate for the shrimping community, and then end in the Gulf of Mexico with a red snapper fisherman named Wayne Werner, who has been really instrumental in reforming fisheries management to bring back red snapper populations from which were virtually wiped out, to bring them back to this tremendous abundance. So the chapter I want to read from is chapter 2, which is about the Kansas farmer, and there's a couple reasons I want to do that. One is because it's my favorite chapter, but the second is because the Kansas farmer is actually here. Justin Knopf and his wife Lindsay flew out yesterday from central Kansas for their very first visit to New York City to be here for this event. Justin was my most challenging subject. He was a very reluctant starlet. He said no to me 4 or 5 times before he finally said yes, but he then opened up his life and his world to me in this really amazing way. And so Justin farms on almost 5,000 acres that his mother's family, who were Swedish immigrants, they homesteaded right after the Civil War. And for generations, they farmed the way people have farmed for 10,000 years. They went out with plows and they broke the sod and they turned the soil over and they created those incredibly beautiful black, fragrant, straight, long furrows that we all associate with the Heartland, the most beautiful, iconic scene of the Heartland. You know it from Currier and Ives, you know it from Grant Wood. When I was working on this book, I went back to Willa Cather and was really struck at how Willa Cather describes, she really sees an orderly farm as indicative of an orderly soul. That it's the dissolute families in her novels, their farms are also dissolute, everything is ragged, and the families that are upright and morally sound and industrious have these beautiful geometries. She was like a modern artist, Willa Cather. She loved these perfect geometries. So that's how Justin's family farmed for generations. And Willa Cather describes, in O Pioneers, which is about a Swedish family very much like Justin's, she talks about the brown earth yielding to the plow with a blissful sigh. I'm paraphrasing a little bit. Well, that was written in 1913, and we all know what happened 20 years later, in the 30s, when we had, after prolonged drought, some steady winds started blowing, and 10 million acres of the richest soils in the world picked up and blew away. We lost half a foot up to 2 feet of topsoil in a cloud. It blew sometimes across Kansas in a cloud 10,000 feet high and 200 miles wide. And we lost what is essentially a non-renewable resource. That soil had taken the Mississippi River millions of years to build, and here it was up and blown away, because it turns out that when you break the sod and you turn those prairie soils over, they become highly vulnerable to erosion, to wind erosion and to water erosion. They turn into a kind of hard pan. They collapse. All the beautiful space in those soils that allow air and water to penetrate collapse into a hard pan, and the soil can't take water anymore, which, as drought and heat get worse and worse and worse in the Great Plains, becomes an increasingly critical problem. And the worst damage that was done, which we didn't even know about until the science of microbiology flowered in the last decades, was the damage to the life in the soil. Soil is the most diverse ecosystem on the planet. It's got more biodiversity than a tropical rainforest, than the ocean, and it's all microbes. There are uncounted species, undoubtedly thousands, maybe tens of thousands of species, trillions of organisms in every teaspoon, and they are the foundation of life on Earth. They make photosynthesis possible, from which all of our food and all of our air comes from. They are critical to every plant that Justin grows. So Justin has totally revised the way his family farms, along with many farmers like him across the Great Plains. They have retired their plows. They now farm in a way. Justin has not plowed in more than 15 years. He also has introduced enormous and ever-increasing diversity into his thousands of acres. So he keeps adding in new rotations of crops, and he also adds in cover crops that they're not commercial crops. He never harvests them, but he plants mixes of crops, and those help protect and re-nourish the soil. He is the furthest thing from a small, organic, local farmer, but his soils are rebounding in a really remarkable way. The levels of carbon and organic matter in his soils and the level of life in his soils are beginning to approach the native prairie, and that's a really important achievement given how critical big farmers in the heartland are for all of our future. So I want to read just a little bit. I spent many, many hours tromping around Justin's fields with him. You walk on this beautiful tatami mat of stalks and residues from previous crops, and and listening to Justin talk about why he farms the way he farms. So I want to read just a little bit of Justin's chapter. See if I can manage all of these things here. Justin's fields now look nothing like his grandfather's tidy furrows, though his acres of wheat and alfalfa and milo are still marked off like Willa Cather's vast checkerboard, light and dark, dark and light. They're messy, the knee-high stubble standing like Bart Simpson's hair, with a thick, tangled mat of straw or frozen-out leaves covering the ground. Where his predecessors set out to clear away or tame nature, Justin strives to emulate the native prairie. We have large, sometimes very violent, dangerous thunderstorms in the spring, with heavy rainfall, heavy winds, and then we get dry, hot, and windy, and then very cold with blizzards. The prairie can weather all that. It is steady, resilient across long periods of time. Our farms on the prairie have to learn to do the same, to be resilient to these dramatic, harsh forces. Farming like the prairie requires, he says, learning how to come alongside that biology, to partner with it. It also requires resisting the temptation to think we can control it. A living system is complex, always changing and adapting. That's part of its mystery. And that mystery, the need to deal with lots of uncontrolled things, is where my faith plays into myself as a farmer. Science is part of it, technology is part of it, but humility is part of it as well. Farming in concert with the prairie requires constant, close, almost paternal attention. Justin knows the land intimately through soil testing and data analysis, but even more through his own senses and hands. In an essay she wrote for an online writing class, Lindsay describes watching Justin studying, seeing things I can't see, turning the wheat over in his hands, examining every square inch with the eye of a scientist and the touch of a father. His nail scrapes away at something, his nose almost touching the wheat. Justin is as often striding across a field as he is cocooned in a tractor, opening a furry soybean pod to bite into one of the tiny egg yolk yellow seeds to see if it's ready for harvest, stopping to dig with a small shovel he carries everywhere, or crouching to sink his big hands deep into the black, fragrant soil. He's often joined by his young employee, Garrett Kennedy, a bright young K-State graduate who reminds Justin of himself fresh out of college. Though Garrett is so skinny, the shovel barely notices him when he jumps on. Sometimes Andrew, Justin and Lindsay's son, comes along too with his own pint-sized shovel, diligently digging alongside his dad. It would be hard to say who is more excited by their discoveries, especially the fat earthworms whose excavations and excretions inspire in Justin a thrill and awe so fervent as to verge on comical. Even a pile of their castings brings him joy. Oh, this is wonderful. This shiny material is their poop, or frass, very rich for plants. They burrow down 5 feet or more, eating all the time, filling their bellies with nutrients that they carry from deep in the soil up to the root zone and carrying other things back down. In deep drought, they go deeper still, tie themselves in a knot, and go dormant. We can't see fungi or bacteria, so earthworm activity is my best measure of biological activity. What a gift this is. So, Justin, thank you for sharing your life with me.
Didn't you have an earthworm that was like 4 feet long?
One of my friends has a photo of one. I haven't found one on my phone.
Oh, okay.
Still looking.
But
Yes.
was it 4 feet long, like just a night crawler type of thing? That's incredible.
These guys carry pictures of their worms around with them to show each other.
I thought it was also cool that you grew wheat didn't you grow wheat in like downtown Cleveland?
Lindsay.
That's pretty amazing too. Yeah, that's a great chapter, and no-till farming is so inspiring as a concept. Just to read about it, having read a lot about the dust storms of the 30s and seen the pictures of them and talked to people who were in them. It's just amazing to think that that's something that could be that you could actually do something about, you know. But so I was just as I read your book, what impressed me was how down to like the square foot it got in terms of geography and in terms of the places where the people were. And it sort of reminded me, you know, that here sometimes in New York, well, when my book about the Great Plains came out, I had people say to me, "Oh, I liked your book about Iowa." I said, "Well, it's not actually Iowa." and I'm from Ohio, and of course the standard thing that people in New York say is, "Ohio, yes, here we call that Iowa." So, did you find, I mean, and this leads to some kind of another strange thought, but it made me think that Democrats may not be very good at geography in general, you know, that Republicans are better at geography. This is just an instinct that I had, because I feel like you're talking about, these are red states, all the places that you go, and yet you have such everybody seems to have this incredible knowledge of the place where they are. Did you start with the place and look for people in the place, or did you start with the people and become interested in the place where the people were? That is, how did you get together with Justin and with the people?
I started with the people. I had I spent a lot of my own childhood on a farm in California with some farmers who are really extraordinary stewards, take a very, very long view of the land. And then in my 20s, I worked for the Forest Service in Colorado. And in both cases, I had really gotten exposed to how deeply people who live and work on the land know it, how much they understand it and love it in a way that, I mean, I was out of the Bay Area and thought I knew everything, and I realized that I knew nothing at all when I got to Colorado about a forest and how you had to take care of a forest. And then I've been at Environmental Defense Fund for 12 years, and Environmental Defense Fund is sort of unusual in seeking out partners like Justin, in working with industrial scale farmers and working with commercial fishermen and working with corporate CEOs of barge companies and trying to move some of these really big levers in the world to make change. So I had been hearing stories for years from my colleagues about people like Justin, people who were doing this really tremendous work that was going completely overlooked by most of us, and certainly by most of the people in the environmental community. So I started canvassing really everyone I knew for good subjects, and slowly began to converge on this idea of using the Mississippi as the narrative spine for the book, and sort of loved when I started looking at maps and realizing that it was the Louisiana Purchase, and it was Huck Finn and Lewis and Clark's journeys, and it was Red America, and it was where all of our natural resources are, with a few exceptions. The geography really began to speak to me, and so then, you know, it kind of fell into place. Montana, I had to look a little extra hard because the first cowboy I found was on the wrong side of the Continental Divide. So he was...
How far over?
It was over where you used to live.
Oh,
You used to
really?
live in the Swan, right?
Yeah.
He lived in Ovando, Jim Stone. And
Ovando.
so, but the water, you know, that water...
But you mention him in the piece.
I do,
he-
yeah,
in the
because
part,
the
he plays a
cowboy
big
I write
part.
about, Dusty, is part of this huge partnership that spans the divide, that spans 10 million acres. But so I had to start with them and ask them for a rancher on the right side of the divide whose water would flow down to Justin's farm and flow down into the Mississippi. But other than that, the geography really just sort of fell nicely into place.
I mean, the people are distributed. You know, you have Far West, and then you have the Merritt Enterprise, the barge owner is, I mean, they're like, part of their operation is all the way up in the Illinois River, right?
Right.
I mean, they're almost up to Chicago.
Right, and they go up the Tennessee River and the Cumberland River. They go all the way into, I mean, the Mississippi watershed goes from the Rocky Mountains to the Appalachians. And the tributaries that feed it, it does look like this enormous funnel. So the tributaries that feed it go all the way, well, and as you point out, you actually can start here and go through the Great Lakes and come down the Mississippi, that there's actually a connected waterway all the way there. So you look at those tributaries. So yeah, they work all the way up the Illinois River. They carry coal. They mostly carry oil and gas and chemicals. They carry what are called red flag cargoes. I went out with them I spent 24 hours on a towboat with 8 men pushing 4 football fields of oil barges up the Mississippi River, and it is mind-blowing, the traffic on that river. It is basically bumper-to-bumper traffic of coal barges and grain barges and rock barges and fuel barges and everything you can imagine. I mean, you really see that there is still an industrial heart and an agricultural heart in this country that is still really enormously important. But so yeah, it was really the people, and then, I mean, I sort of had an embarrassment of riches. There were dozens of other stories that I could have told that would have been nearly as good. And so I then had the latitude to kind of find this nice journey in the...
Well, in every one, it's also kind of a cliffhanger, you know? Like, you don't know, are they going to be able, in the story about the cowboy, will that work? He has all these different people who are so, that he can get all these different people to work together is really amazing. His patience, really all the people you talk about are so patient and able to deal with people yelling at him from both sides.
Well, and open. I mean, the thing that really struck me, and you're absolutely right, I mean, Montana is a great example of a place where people hate each other's guts. I mean, that's where the spotted owl fight, took place in western Montana and over into the Pacific Northwest. Probably the nastiest natural resource fight, one of the nastiest natural resource fights ever in the history of the United States. You've got the Bundy trial starting this week. You've got the ranchers hate the hippies, hate the hikers, hate the hunters, hate the outfitters, hate the loggers, hate the they all hate the federal bureaucrats. But somehow, they all came together. I mean, there were exceptions. There are people who never joined.
And there are friendships that end forever, which is tragic in a way. I mean, it's his best man.
Best man has never spoken to him again because they saw him. First, he fought a bunch of oil and gas leases that were going to go in and change one of the largest contiguous. The Montanans call it the last best place. It's the largest contiguous intact landscape outside of Alaska in the United States. It's 10 million acres that looks almost like it did when Lewis and Clark went up there. And so Dusty came back from the rodeo and got involved in that fight, and that was what caused the rift with his best man, because they were sort of seeing visions of the Bakken dancing in front of their eyes. Of course, people in the Bakken wish now the Bakken had never happened. But they saw what they thought was going to be huge fortunes to be made. And Dusty and some of the other guys knew that once you destroy this stuff, you can't turn it back. You can't get it back. And he says that. And Justin's son walked around for months imitating Dusty, saying, there's more shingles than grass, it's too late, partner. So it's real, they had a sense, but yeah, it has been, and that's been one of the inspiring things about the book, is to actually see that there are places where people still can bridge these vast political divides.
Right.
And
it's like we're so used to just stasis, and things not getting done. But these are local situations where things do get done.
Absolutely.
I found it hair-raising, the descriptions of the barges going down the Mississippi, where you've now got either an enormous flood, which is just hellaciously difficult to keep control of a barge, or you've got, 9 feet, 10 inches of water, and you've got a 9-foot draft on your barge. And so, how they managed to deal with this incredibly very difficult waterway. And I was out there, I did a piece about invasive carp, and I was out there a while ago and read the infrastructure of the Mississippi is just falling apart.
Yeah,
it is just not being maintained.
Yeah.
And that comes through also in your book, how this guy manages to keep pushing those barges through when he's either got, flood or drought.
Yeah, no, they have nerves of steel. And I went back, I used this book as an excuse to go read all the great American literature. So I also went back and read some more Mark Twain. And And of course, he describes in Life on the Mississippi what it means to learn to be a riverboat pilot on that river. And he gets very caught. He spends weeks learning, going up the river and learning every bend and every sandbar. And he gets to the top and he's really cocky. And the guy that's been teaching him says, well, of course, you know it's a completely different river going down. And it'll be a completely different river tomorrow because the sand will have shifted. And so it's the level of acute alertness that these guys have to maintain. They've got, lives on board. They've got these dangerous fuels. They've got, dangerous cargo. And the weather, as Justin well knows, the weather is getting more and more extreme all the time. So they are swinging. They will have 1 month the Army Corps will be blasting levees to try to release the flood, and the next month they'll be dredging the bottom to try to deal with the drought. It's swinging like crazy. And that's another thing they all have in common, and that was a great advantage of focusing in on this geography is they are really on the front lines of a lot of the changes that are happening in terms of prolonged drought, in terms of rains that come much more intensely, that are much more concentrated, in terms of pests that are moving across where they didn't used to find, or they didn't used to exist.
I thought it was really cool that you described this guy. He's telling how to go around like a bend, and this really tough part where you're going around the bend, and you just have to let it drift, and you just have to hold your breath and let it drift before you kick the motor in, or the steam engine in again. And you found an exact parallel in Twain, where Twain says, letting it drift was the hardest thing in the world.
Yeah, it just terrified him.
And, you think of Twain as like, well, he went out and was a steamboat captain for a while and kind of made his brand like that. But in fact, he really did learn the river and did do some very, very difficult things.
He was navigating much smaller vessels. These
Right.
guys, John
Yeah.
McPhee said it was like shooting rapids in an aircraft carrier. These things are so huge, you can't believe it. The captain walked me to the front of the barges, and it took us 10 minutes to walk from the wheelhouse to the front of the barge. It is so vast, and it wasn't anything like the biggest thing out on the water. So these things are so huge, and they're navigating them through these narrows, and with the water whipping them around. It also is sort of one of the central themes in the book is learning, and Justin, in the passage I read, Justin talks about it. You can't control it. You have to accept that there's a lot of it, first of all, that we can't understand. The microbiology, it will be hundreds of or thousands of years before we actually understand everything that's living in the soil and what it's doing, how these ecologies are working. But so there's a lot of yielding up to natural forces. So with the Mississippi River, it's yielding up to those forces to navigate it, but it's also in the wetlands, realizing that the only way they're going to save these wetlands, the Louisiana wetlands, which are vanishing into the sea, 2,000 square miles have vanished into the sea, that the only way to do it is to use the power of the river, is to release the river in a controlled way, but to release the river and let this force that is greater than any human engine ever could be carry that mud again into those wetlands. So there is a kind of letting go that happens with a lot of them.
Yeah, and the Corps of Engineers kind of comes across as like, I don't know, something in a cartoon or something. They do this, and then they go, oh no, and then they go do that. And,
That's a great description.
And so so now they're kind of saying, gee, maybe we shouldn't have done some of these things, and let's just let it kind of go its way. The Vietnamese who you talk about have been there 40 years. You still think,
Right,
I think,
just
yeah, they just
yesterday.
got here yesterday, but of course they've had a whole generation there. And a lot of every story really that you tell, you talk about the ancestry of the people and how they got there, and it's always a difficult story. And the story of Sandy, Wen is how you pronounce it?
Yeah.
How she got there in her father's fishing boat, which he sank in order to be allowed on shore.
Right.
So to give the host country no choice. The tough lives that those people have had, and to see that this particular, it's kind of funny that in that chapter you think, oh, okay, great, well, we'll just let the river fill in all this silt. And then they go, but wait a minute, that silts up our shrimp beds. So, those must have been very amazing people. You also described what the cuisine, which is just a total new thing in the book, all the different things that
Well,
they're
my
eating.
daughter told me that I should just do a presentation, should be the greatest meals I had in every place that I went. And
Yeah.
I think I am, when I'm in New Orleans, I think I am going to do that. I mean, truly one of the greatest meals was when I was with the Vietnamese shrimpers. We flew out in a seaplane to one of the shrimping boats, and everywhere you go in this community, I mean, food is so central to the culture, and so we fly out there, and they invite us to lunch, and the Vietnamese shrimpers are always padding around in their little pajamas and slippers, but they pull in a net of shrimp, they take the shrimp into the kitchen on the boat, and they boil them up, and they have brought with them on the boat, which they do as a matter of course, it wasn't just for us, they brought those rice crepes that you soften in hot water, and they brought those delicious like basils and mints and various herbs, and they brought pork belly, and they brought rice noodles, and they brought hot sauce, and we make these fresh shrimp wraps on the boat that I will never forget for the rest of my life. It was really one of the most, and I had many fabulous meals with Sandy, but I had great meals all the way along, including at Justin and Lindsay's house.
You end the book, or the last part takes place mostly in the Gulf, with Wayne, the fisherman, and your description of the Gulf, I guess people are sort of aware of what the Gulf looks like from having watched the horrible Deepwater Horizon coverage, but talk a little bit about what the Gulf looks like. I hadn't realized it's just an industrial floor, basically, is what you're describing.
It was completely shocking to me, because, I mean, it's very wild. I got terribly seasick out there. It's truly rugged waters, and we went out about 90 miles to go fishing, but everywhere you look, there are these oil rigs that are the biggest thing you've ever seen in your life. It's like you're on in a space colony. These things they look like those things in the Return of the Jedi, those Imperial walkers in the Return of the Jedi, except 100 times bigger than those, and they're completely strung with lights. So you look off into the water, you don't ever really see stars. You see these sort of industrial constellations extending as far as the eye can see, and you actually fish at the rigs. The red snapper really like rigs. They are basically like reefs for them. So we would go out, and Wayne would be looking for the fish. We were out fishing with his nephew, and he would be looking for the fish with his sonar, and invariably he would find them gathering around the rig. So we would have this, pristine nature experience fishing in the shadow of a monstrous oil rig.
And they're catching hundreds of thousands of pounds of snapper. I mean,
they're pulling them in on these. It's all hook and line, but they're they put multiple hooks on these lines, and so when they pull them up, it looks like a Christmas tree with these beautiful, shiny red ornaments on either side. And it is an amazing landscape, which I was not at all prepared for.
Well, one of the great pleasures of the book is the American landscape, and you go from, Choteau, Montana, all the way out into the Gulf, and it's something that you don't see all that much anymore, where someone will take an entire thing and try and describe it. It's much more now what people try and do is describe just one thing, and find one thing, like, the history of, some one particular thing. But and it's something I found with the Great Plains, in that, in a way, it's easier to talk about the country if you go north and south than if you go east and west.
Oh, that's interesting.
East and west, you get New York and LA, and it's a kind of tired plot. But if you go north and south, it's quite interesting.
Yeah.
Or more interesting. Anyway, we want to have questions, and we've got about 15 minutes or so, or less, I don't know, for questions. Mr. Hertzberg.
Why are these states red?
Who are you directing that question to, Rick? Maybe I'll ask you that question. Why are they red?
Well,
Wow.
you've talked about what global warming is doing to their environment, and if you're blue, you accept the reality of that, and if you're red, you don't. So how come there's...
Well, I think it's actually more complicated than that, and I'll invoke Justin again as another example. I mean, Justin and I ended up talking about climate a lot, and, it's still not an easy conversation to have in Kansas. The politics are interesting because, like, if you go to Louisiana, if you listen to Louisiana's leadership when they're in Washington, D.C., like David Vitter, climate change doesn't exist. If you follow them home to Louisiana, they're totally accepting the UN's science on sea level rise, and when they're developing a master plan for the Louisiana coast, they're relying on that science they're calculating in sea level rise and intensifying hurricanes as part of the plan. So the politics, I think, get more authentic and interesting if you leave the sort of media bubble and the political bubble in Washington, and if you go have these conversations closer to the ground. So Justin took me up to K-State, where he went to school, to meet his professors. And, well, first we walked by, they have all these, he showed me all these labs where he had to do all these tests. Like, he had to be able to tell pigweed from some other weed, and they were doing all these experiments making different shaped wheat heads. But one of the labs looked like the Sonoran Desert. It was all cactuses and sand. And Justin said, oh, well, maybe that's my farm in 20 years. There's the climate change lab. But when we went to talk to his professors, they all were completely clear that climate change is happening, but they also were clear that that's not a useful way to talk to their state legislators. So they talked to their state legislators about extreme weather and about the Oglala aquifer that's being depleted. And the same conversation is happening increasingly among farmers. If you look at the ag press, and Justin shared some really interesting articles from, increasingly in the mainstream ag press, people have moved from, so the first step is extreme weather is happening, and we have to figure out ways to be more resilient to that weather. And so we have to do things like no-tilling that keep water in the soil and that protect our soils. The next step is, okay, this maybe seems to be a trend, that, maybe this is happening a lot, but we're going to leave aside, this is Merritt Lane, the CEO of the barge company, this is his stance is, I don't see any purpose in getting in the fight about what's causing it, but let's deal with it. Let's deal with the fact that the climate is getting more extreme, and let's make things better in any way that we can. Let's make more efficient vessels. Let's do everything, let's keep pollution out of the atmosphere. Let's do everything we can. And then the next step is to say, okay, well, and I hope, Justin, it's okay that I will quote you saying this, as Justin says is, okay, well, if the problem is that there's too much carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide going into the atmosphere, I have things I can do on my farm that offer solutions for that. I have ways of farming that can actually store carbon in the soil and that can prevent nitrogen from being lost from my fertilizer into the atmosphere. So it's, there's a woman that I quote in the Dusty chapter who says, if you listen to people and you give them a chance to not be defensive about their lives and their choices, you can actually really get somewhere. And what I loved about doing this book was having these conversations. I mean, Justin's heard me say this before. I felt like I could ask Justin anything. I could ask him, I pushed hard on him on neonicotinoid insecticides, which are these insecticides that people are really concerned are having detrimental effects on pollinators, along with a lot of other things. But there's evidence that they are one of the contributors. Not only did Justin engage that conversation for hours and hours and hours with me, but he went and he read, and he's the only person I know who has read the whole 380-page EPA report that they did on the particular chemical that he had been using. And he modified the way that he farms. I mean, there is a level of openness in the people that I met, and it wasn't just that I found, the 5 enlightened guys in the Heartland. I mean, Justin is part of huge networks of thousands of farmers, many of them who are young like him and who have come out of land-grant colleges like he has, and who are very high-tech and very sophisticated in the science, who are challenging themselves constantly and inviting other people to challenge them, including New York environmentalists. I had to pass a test. Justin took me to the No Till on the Plains conference, and I'm like, none of them have ever even met a New Yorker before, and they're all like, who is this interloper that Justin has brought in? And I had to pass a test at the lunch table. They all wheeled on me and said, so what do you think of GMOs? And I'm not going to tell you what my answer was, but I passed the test.
Oh, yeah?
I wanted to ask Justin a couple questions. First of all, I'm worried, now that you're not plowing in those neat furrows, has that affected your family life at all? Has it become more dissolute? And second of all, what was it like dealing with a New Yorker coming to you? Did you pick up anything from Miriam that actually changed your way of looking at things? Or just, I'd like to hear what you have to say.
Good questions. The first answer about my family life, it actually, we spent a lot less time, when my dad's generation, when my dad was farming, a lot of your success or failure, I would say, you had to make good choices, but you also had to work really hard and spend a lot of hours working the land and spending time in the fields. And your success in some regards, I think, was based upon how hard you could work. And today, it's much more, I don't spend all those hours tilling the land that we did when I was young. And so we're much more efficient with our time, and we spend much more, so I'd like to say I spend a lot more time at home with my kids, which I do. It's really important to me. That's part of how we think about our farm, is how we appreciate our lifestyle and working with our family and several generations together, and teaching the kids about sense of place and the land and things that extend well beyond our lifetime. So yeah, that's changed kind of what we spend our time doing, and the success in my generation is not so much, yeah, we still have to work hard and be timely with the things that we do on the farm, but it's much more based on knowledge and your amount of knowledge per acre, if you will, or spending time thinking and studying and re-evaluating, challenging other peers that want to be challenged, and how to improve our system. And so that kind of almost leads into your second question about how it was to handle Miriam. The first day Miriam came, actually, we were right in the thick of wheat harvest, which is a very intense time. We work as many hours as we can when the environmental conditions, the weather and the humidity allow us to be harvesting in the wheat fields, because at any moment one of those large thunderstorms can come across the plains and have a hail and if a lot of hail that marble to baseball size, and we can lose our entire year's crop in about 5 minutes. And so when the crop is ready, we work really hard from as many hours as we can. And that's when Miriam came. She flew into Wichita in south central Kansas, and I gave her directions in a rental car. So we're kind of at the end of a sand road, and I was like, well, this is going to be interesting, and if she can find us, and she did. And she brought her little notepad and her pen records your voice when it speaks, which was really intimidating at first. And she just started asking questions and learning, and it was very intellectually challenging to me. I'm tired during that time of the year anyways, but I was tired at a whole new level that year because of all the thought that I had to do at the same time while running the combine. But my experience has been that I was very apprehensive to participate in this. Farmers tend to, we tend to be introverts and not be, it's difficult for us to open our entire world up to many people because it's somewhat of an intimate world, because the land, in my opinion, reflects a lot of our personal selves. And so it's difficult, it was a big choice for us to open ourselves up in this way. But my experience has been that Miriam was so honoring of that and wanted to truly understand the complex decisions that we make and how we navigate those decisions. And that was pretty apparent off from the start. And so as time went on, that level of trust increased. And I have learned a lot from Miriam and appreciate the things I have learned and the hard questions that she asked me, and it's a healthy conversation and has improved my farm by having her there, which I haven't told you that, but I do, yeah, that's true. So, yeah, thank you.
I'm curious about your thoughts on the view of, I guess, the other environmental activists, not the conservation heroes that you described, but more kind of mainstream and sometimes kind of ecological activists who, don't have much trust for the ranchers and the farmers and the fishermen and all. And your thoughts on that and what might bridge that divide, because it seems like a pretty serious one to me.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. So the question was, what about the activists that aren't prepared to trust an industrial scale farmer or to find conservationists in the heartland? And I think that, I mean, it is a hard question. You know, there are people whose view of Environmental Defense Fund is that we are too ready to partner with companies like Walmart, who we do partner with. We have an office in Bentonville. There are real tension. There have been tensions within the environmental community. I think that it's fair to say that there has been an evolution, at least in the bigger groups that you would have heard of, that there is a convergence around a kind of pragmatism, a recognition that it's now or never, and that if you hold out for, you know, the perfect, if you hold out, not only that if you hold out for the perfect you may not get anywhere, but also that the idea of the perfect is itself flawed, that you know, you really see this in food production, that there's a sort of an idea that if Justin were just a better guy, he just would get rid of every pesticide on his farm, or, you know, he certainly wouldn't use GMOs. And when you actually start to look at the choices that Justin's making, every choice that you make comes with trade-offs. And so the really honorable way to farm is to be candid about that and to really consider what the choices are, so that if you forego pesticides and you end up losing an entire crop, you've therefore lost every natural resource that you put into that crop. You've lost all the water you put into it. You've lost all the diesel you put in your tractor. You've lost the land that you've used. And so that you constantly are having to weigh in the balance these choices. And I think that the environmental community more and more is, I mean, in part because of the urgency of climate change and the urgency of the challenges that we're facing in everything from invasive species, you know, all of the things that are coming along with climate change, and the loss of wild lands, and the loss of important private habitat, the endangered species issues. I think there is a growing convergence around sort of a middle that is not about. It never feels quite like compromise to me. It's not like you're giving up half of what you believe in. It's that you're digging deeper. You're listening to a more complicated story. And I mean, some of the people that I met over where Ian used to live on the west side of the Continental Divide, in Montana, I mean, one woman had her tires slashed about 10 times because she was like this hippie who'd moved in from Seattle, and she was doing political cartoons in the newspaper that were like pictures of clear cuts, and so she was like really going after the loggers, and then she started working with a logger and trying to find common ground with him, and she realized that both of them felt like the best day they could find was a day in the woods, and they started walking in the woods, and she said the longer that this group of people who thought they had nothing in common, the longer they genuinely talked and listened, the more a consensus sort of emerged. It wasn't like, okay, I'll give this up if you give that up. It wasn't this kind of parceling out the pain. It was actually realizing that if you pull in a richer story, if you pull in more parameters, that you can arrive at something that actually works better all the way around.
We have time for just one more question.
So when you describe it that way, or I listen to Justin, you make me feel almost hopeful. And but then I think of what you started in the beginning talking about your rancher and his best friend. And when you are faced with such enormous profits like fracking brought to North Dakota, so now we see all of these terrible environmental effects and earthquakes and such. But it just seems that at some point the way that our system is set up and the money is, there's so much money to be made that, you know, you're going to come to some point where there isn't common ground.
So Patty has asked about places where the stakes get so high that you can't actually find common ground. I certainly am not a utopian. I know that there will be places where there just are collisions that are impossible to overcome. On the other hand, I think that Louisiana is a really interesting example. I mean, there is no place on the planet, really, where you have more powerful interests cheek by jowl than you do in Louisiana. I mean, that's another mind-blowing thing about that landscape, is you realize you have the biggest oil companies in the world, America's biggest fisheries, you have, New Orleans and millions of people, you have the biggest port complex in the hemisphere, you have massive, it is the big boys are all sitting there together at those tables, and they managed to figure out a coastal restoration plan that they got total consensus from everyone from ExxonMobil to the Audubon Society and from the entire Louisiana state legislature. And again, it's pushing harder to figure out, okay, so if we can restore wetlands, and Garrett Graves, who's the freshman Republican congressman from Louisiana, and he used to head up the Coastal Restoration Authority in Louisiana, and he tells a story that I repeat in the book about disappearing wetlands, and most of the coast of Louisiana is privately owned. It's almost all owned by oil and gas companies. And so he said, the environmentalists were all like, go take the land away from them and fix that wetland, because it was a really critical, both ecologically, but also the wetlands are critical storm protection for, not only for the city of New Orleans and all those people, but also for that oil and gas infrastructure. It's the biggest oil and gas infrastructure in the country. Most of our oil and gas moves through those ports and those pipelines. And so, but instead he said, we could go to the oil company and say, look, if you help us restore this wetland, not only are you going to hold on to your bottom rights, because if the land disappears on top, you also lose the mineral rights underneath. So you're going to keep your mineral rights, you're going to have shelter from the storm, we're going to get all of these nutrients that are coming down the Mississippi River that are creating algal blooms in the Gulf and choking out life in thousands of miles, and so really harming Louisiana fisheries. That if you replant wetlands, it takes up those nutrients, so the nutrients become like miracle grow for the wetlands, and they're now a good instead of a bad thing in the Gulf of Mexico. So you can come up, sometimes it is sort of mind-blowing that you can come up with these solutions that help everybody. They protect all the people, they protect the oil and gas interests, they protect the fishing interests, they protect the navigation interests. And you can't do it everywhere, but it's actually remarkable that in a place where the stakes are that high, that you did get that kind of unanimity. So you can be hopeful.
A really lovely note to end on. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. Miriam is going to stick around to sign books, so if you already have purchased a copy, we'll just form a queue on this side of the room. We also have a couple copies of Ian's books if you're interested in purchasing those. And thank you to both of you for sharing this evening with us.
Thanks.